Hello again, welcome to another episode of The Brave Front, a podcast with a single purpose, to talk about men's mental health. My name's Tim Bainan, and in each episode, I'm going to be talking to someone who either has an incredible story to share or some thought-provoking insight to give us in regard to what's going on in our heads. And by talking to people with lived experience and professional credentials, I hope we can give you something to mull over each fortnight, so that you can hopefully take aspects of what you've heard into your own life. Whether it's simply through being inspired by someone else's story, or by taking the advice of an expert, if we can play a small part in boosting your mental well-being, well, that's pretty much job done for me. In this episode, we're settling down with a hot cup of cocoa to talk about sleep with Matt Jones, Professor of Neuroscience at the University of Bristol, and an expert on the science behind sleep. Unsurprisingly, there's a close relationship between sleep and mental health. Indeed, I'm sure we've all had times when we've slept well and then again when we haven't. And I'm pretty sure we'd all agree that on those days after a bad night's sleep, we're probably not the nicest people to be around and probably not at our most productive either. I've seen it in my professional life too. Working for a charity that supports fire service personnel with their mental health, I've talked to firefighters in the past who've had trouble sleeping as a result of their work, both in terms of the impact of shift working and the impact of working around trauma. Unchecked, such regular sleep disturbances can have serious physical and mental health implications, as people become trapped in a cycle of increased anxiety and sleeplessness, with one feeding the other. Professor Matt Jones has thrown himself into sleep, though, in an effort to find some answers for us all in regard to what happens inside our minds and our bodies when we sleep, and how all this is linked to our mental well-being. So, I spoke to Matt to find out more about the science behind the one thing none of us can do without: a good night's sleep. Matt, thank you very much. Lovely to meet you. Great to have you on the show. I'm really delighted that you've been able to join us and that you can give us your time today. How are you?
Thanks, Tim. It's a great pleasure to be here. Really appreciate the invitation. I'm okay, thank you. That's what I always say. Yeah, I'm fine. Quite a busy time in the academic calendar because the new term is about to start, but I'm more or less keeping on top of it.
I suppose I've got to ask you, did you sleep well last night?
That's a pertinent question. Unfortunately, I don't sleep as well as I used to. So I used to be quite a smug, good sleeper, but in my old age, I'm 51, and given various anxieties, mainly work-induced, I don't sleep as well as I used to. So I often wake up pretty early and then struggle to get back to sleep again.
Okay, that's
okay last night, but not brilliantly. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's interesting to hear. Now, listen, I'm fascinated by your role and fascinated by the subject of sleep. I've struggled a bit in the past with sleep issues and not being able to get to sleep, or sort of racing thoughts in my mind and that kind of stuff. But before we dig into a bit of the detail, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your role, your job, what it involves as a professor of sleep, as it were, and a bit of an insight perhaps into your day to day. What does it involve?
So technically, I'm not a professor of sleep, much as I might like to be. So I'm a professor of neuroscience here at the University of Bristol. That involves a bit of a juggling act between doing research, so running a team of scientists, PhD students and postdoctoral researchers, with a sort of iterated array of projects. It involves administering research, which is a polite way of saying begging for money to do the research we want to do. So writing funding applications to the government and to charities, for example. And it involves teaching, of course. So trying to inspire the next generation to become sleep researchers. So it's never dull. But like a lot of people in modern Britain, we just tend to complain there's too much of everything. So today, actually, just recently, we submitted a big funding bid to the Medical Research Council, which involved a bit of sleep and mental health research. And so I'm raking through the ashes of all the things I didn't do because I was writing that funding bid.
I want to definitely look at that. You mentioned mental health. I want to look at the link between sleep and mental health in a bit more detail. But perhaps before we sort of delve into that side of things, so we go back to basics. And could you just tell us why is a good night's sleep important? Why do we all need that good night's sleep?
For more than one reason, as you might imagine. And just to sort of frame my perspective a bit, I mean, firstly, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medic. So everything I say is driven by the science that I know and understand, which may be incorrect, of course. And what got me into sleep, which I ignored for many years, actually, as a memory researcher, that's how I started out. What got me into sleep was when I came to realize how rich with possibility the brain is overnight in humans. There's so much going on in our brains during sleep. It's not just like turning down the volume and having our brain cells, our neurons putting their feet up. There really is a lot of active processing. And so sleep makes vital contributions to finessing our mental model of the world, if you like. I mean, what are brains for? Brains are for making our mental model of the world so we can understand our surroundings and other people, and we can optimize our behavior as best we can to get as much as possible out of life. And sleep makes vital contributions to that through its roles in supporting memory, so sort of sifting through what's important, what isn't, integrating new stuff we learn with our existing knowledge. It regulates our emotions, and we've all experienced that to some degree. We tend to be less able to regulate our emotions when we've had a rough night or many rough nights. But it also does other sort of non-cognitive things like dealing with the housekeeping, brain metabolism. It helps to regulate our immune system, our inflammatory state. So, I mean, the good thing about sleep is that it matters to all of us, and it percolates through almost every aspect of our waking lives. And the bad thing about sleep is that as well. It's so hard to disentangle chicken and egg, cause and effect, as a sleep researcher. Am I sleeping badly because I'm anxious? Am I anxious because I'm sleeping badly? Probably a bit of both. So I think the field at large is kind of grappling with going around in those circles and trying to come to terms with that.
I imagine as well, is there such a thing as a typical night's sleep, or does it vary hugely for a multiplicity of different reasons and with different people? I'm assuming that is the case, but is there such a thing as an average night's sleep?
Yeah, it's a great question. And well, there is such a thing as an average, but whether the average reflects something meaningful to individuals, possibly not. I mean, so one key determinant of what sleep should look like on average and what sleep contributes to our lives is age. No, not aging again. But as everyone appreciates, sleep in a newborn baby is very different from sleep in a pensioner. And that's because our bodies are different, our brains' requirements are different, and sleep is structured in different ways and serves different roles at those different stages in life. And then, that also applies from across individuals. If everything was completely stable, our routines were all the same, and we all did all avoided those things we're not supposed to do and all the rest of it, had the luxury of those options, then perhaps our sleep would sort of converge to a pretty steady average, but life ain't like that, is it? So, as I commented when we first met, my sleep, unfortunately, is not as good as it used to be, and that reflects my age. It reflects the nature of my working life, amongst other things. So, it's a weird medium to grapple with, because it is meaningful to everyone, but in different ways. And then there's also that vicious cycle of focusing too much on sleep and worrying about it too much makes it even more elusive. So we have to kind of temper our approach to sleep, I think, particularly at the moment where every week there's another kind of chat GPT generated article on 10 things you should do to sleep well, all that kind of stuff. I think we can just saturate people with that type of media, and people will stop believing it or stop paying attention, which would be a shame. Sure. Because it is, as I said, the nature of brain activity during sleep is so rich with opportunities.
Just looking at that sort of, looking at the population as a whole, then I know as you rightly talked about that sort of, it's okay to talk about averages, but then you've got to accept the reality that every individual is different. But is there, largely speaking, any differences between the way men sleep and the way women sleep when you look at that on sort of average way?
biology has this role, and so that depends on age. I guess, in young adulthood, for example, not huge differences, although there is an effect of the menstrual cycle, which men are blessed with not having to grapple with. Menopause in older women typically is a famous disruptor of sleep. And that sleep disruption exacerbates all the challenges in menopause, for instance. But, for the average healthy young adult, there aren't major differences, or there shouldn't be. Increasingly, sleep equality is coming to the fore as an issue we need to deal with as well. So, the quality or the opportunities for sleep and the environment in which we sleep varies hugely across the globe, across different levels of society, between cities and the countryside. So all these other factors play in and mean that, the average hides quite a wide variety of different quantities and qualities of sleep.
And just looking at mental health in particular, and obviously this podcast, we like to take a sort of close look at the things that impact men's mental health in particular, but mental health in broad terms as well. What are those sort of most significant factors that can impact your mental health that are sleep related, on a positive and a negative way? If you sleep well, what's the positive impact on your mental health? And if you don't sleep so well, or you have trouble with sleeping, what are the sort of significant potential impacts on your mental well-being?
Well, as I said, it's very difficult to cleanly separate cause and effect in this kind of scenario. So if we talk about mental health disorders or diagnoses, then depression, for example, is famously associated with disrupted sleep. People living with depression struggle to get to sleep or to maintain sleep. And it's hard to categorically demonstrate that which came first. Of course, if you are depressed, then often you have things on your mind, you tend to ruminate on stuff, and that can keep you awake. Equally, if you take a healthy individual and stop them from sleeping, experimentally, for example, then they're more likely to become depressed. So there's almost always a bidirectional relationship. But we do know that, that there is a weight of evidence showing that sleep disruption prior to the onset of a mental health disorder can, if not cause, then at least exacerbate that disorder. A useful example is a jet lag, for example. So people living with bipolar disorder, for instance, often have a sense of which phase they're in. Are they in a depressed phase or a manic phase? And fly across the Atlantic, and that sort of abrupt shift in your daily rhythm, your circadian cycle, will often trigger some sort of episode or shift in symptoms in bipolar disorder. So, it's not a nice example, but it's a case study which shows that disrupting sleep can lead to or exacerbate mental health problems. Psychotic disorders like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are associated with sleep disruption. Almost any brain disease you care to mention, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, are also associated with sleep disruption. So it's always in the mix there. It doesn't mean it's the only culprits and the only thing we should be treating or worrying about. But often it's overlooked, and I think the field is catching up a bit and factoring sleep into both the mental well-being and the mental health disorders that people live with.
Is the converse true as well, in respect of the fact that if somebody does present with any of those range of mental health issues that you mentioned, if looking at how they're sleeping and helping them to sleep better, does that have a positive impact on those situations as well?
Yeah, there's good evidence now that is the case. Even in the general populace, some evidence that pretty very low risk and relatively cheap and easy to implement interventions like improving sleep hygiene can improve sleep quality, and that has a knock-on benefit for mental well-being. And that seems to apply in patients as well. And that's great news because it gives us a real toolkit which allows us to try and improve people's sleep without taking any risks, really, or even spending much money. Just giving people advice on how to approach their sleep. And I guess the next stage would be something like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. These are very safe, there's no side effects, And, if they work, that's fantastic.
And looking at some of the men that you've studied over time and that have come to you, looking for some answers. What are some of the most common? You mentioned depression there, and as being a potential cause for poor sleep. Is there, what are the most sort of common reasons why people come to you, or that you see in the field as being the most common?
So again, I'm not a doctor, so nobody comes to me. Don't, for heaven's sake, go to a scientist. And so it's rather us going to them. I haven't worked directly on people living with depression. My own research program is focused on psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. And the most common symptom of sleep in those kinds of disorders is a fragmentation. So overall, on average, the amount of sleep might be in the normal range, but it tends to occur in these shorter bouts. It's interrupted frequently during the night, and that, as everyone or most people unfortunately know, is not restorative, as we say. You don't wake up feeling refreshed. That's the recurring theme, really. I mean, that's true of age-related reduction in sleep quality as well. We're particularly interested in my own research in children and young people who are at risk of developing psychiatric disorders, and measuring sleep in those populations to understand whether, firstly, is sleep disruption a sort of canary in the coal mine, which highlights people who are most vulnerable, and secondly, of course, if so, can we intervene early at an age when the brain is still developing, because your brain's still being polished off into your early 20s typically. Can we intervene early and keep people on a happier track, if you like? Sleep disruption is a major problem in other disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, for example, where the nature of the disruption is quite different there. So, that often features recurrent nightmares related to the trauma that's triggered the diagnosis. So it's not, sleep disruption is prevalent, but comes in these different flavors in different groups of people.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned PTSD there. I work for the Firefighters Charity, which is a charity that supports fire rescue service personnel who come to us for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons sometimes they do come to us is exactly because they've worked around trauma for most of their professional lives. They've seen a lot of things. They've suffered psychologically with some dealing with some of those things. And 9 times out of 10, those people report issues with their sleep. And we offer sleep workshops at the charity to help people to, with their sleep hygiene and to help them sort of get a good night's sleep at the end of the day. And those are probably one of the most well attended sessions that we run, and people really see the benefit of it. So there seems to be a close link, doesn't there, between especially around trauma and working around those kind of situations and the impact that those kind of things can have. And I imagine it's the same with stress and work of any kind impacts how well you sleep at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's right. So in terms of relating that to the neuroscience of what's going on in our heads during sleep, that the brain reactivates information that's been learned during the preceding day, and that reactivation is part of the memory processing that goes on during sleep, and part of the sort of emotional tuning of those memories, if you like. And so it's easy to imagine, and this is yet to be proven really, but we do know from some experiments that aversive traumatic experiences are more likely to be reactivated during that sort of subconscious sleep state. And in some cases that might be useful, that might help to dissipate the trauma associated with those experiences. And in other cases it might not. It might kind of embed that trauma in a way that leads to a PTSD or related problems.
Why do our brains do that? Why do our brains kind of play that awful trick on us though? If we've seen something that we've experienced and it's a horrible thing, we don't want to relive it, we go to sleep and our brain's reliving it. Why is it doing that to us?
So they don't only reactivate bad stuff, they reactivate good stuff as well. So for example, an unexpected rewarding experience, the brain code for that information is more likely to be reactivated as well. One hypothesis is that the reactivation in a healthy, good sleep scenario, helps to set that trauma in the appropriate emotional context. So you can kind of zoom out a bit and put it in perspective, and that will help you to deal with it. But if, for example, that reactivation of that trauma experience coincides with some bad sleep, or I know something else is going on in your life at the time, that maybe triggers those longer lasting maladaptive, those non-useful changes. I mean, the field, the jury is still out really as to whether sleep around the time of trauma is a good thing or a bad thing. So there's a recent meta-analysis, so an analysis of lots of other studies that was published last month, which suggests that sleeping immediately after trauma, which of course is easier said than done, you don't always get the opportunity, but were you able to, that on balance is probably a good thing. That probably then gives your brain the opportunity to process that trauma in a healthy way. But it's not a very strong effect, and it's a little unclear. And obviously it's very hard to study how the nature of sleep before you experience the trauma might also influence the longer term outcomes, because typically we don't know how people have been sleeping before they've experienced the trauma, unless it's an experimental one. And God knows there's lots of trauma gone on with floods and earthquakes over the last week or so, and it's not like people can say, okay, well, I've just experienced an earthquake, I better get a good rest now, because of course that's when you're most aroused, you're highly strung. It's complicated.
But I just wonder as well, in terms of mental health and what the studies say or what the research shows in regards to whether or not people sleep better. One thing we know with mental health is that men struggle to talk about a lot of things that are on their mind. Sometimes they bottle things up and internalize things, and they get worse and worse in their mind, and they struggle to sleep, and they struggle to do anything because they can't get beyond what's going on in their minds and the issues behind that. But what we do find, and what people tell us, is that talking helps with that. Does the research suggest that talking and taking positive action with your mental health ultimately helps improve your sleep as well?
Yeah, there is research evidencing that, and I think ideally it would be talking with other people, but even a step towards that, kind of documenting, maybe writing down some of your own feelings and concerns, maybe even documenting the stuff you're worried about that's going to happen the next day before you go to sleep. And it's a bit counterintuitive, because you might think that's going to set your mind racing, but actually there is some evidence that can help as well. And I think from my own experience, I'm a pretty average by most respects 50-year-old bloke. I'm not very good at talking about stuff. I do find talking about stuff quite exhausting, actually, but it's in quite a good way. It is in a kind of weight off my shoulders kind of way, which then often does actually help me to sleep after that exchange. So it's all, we have to be careful not to be too anecdotal, but it's all quite intuitive, really. Yeah. Doesn't mean blokes are going to do it, but true, I'm as bad as the next man, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge that we're always going to face, but it's good to hear that there is definitely that link there potentially around, the fact that you do take the time and effort to open up a bit, then it might actually help you sleep better at the end of the day as well. So that's a positive, I think. Just going back to that whole sort of conversation around working around trauma and working in stressful environments, do you think there should be any kind of obligation on employers to bear the impacts of what they're expecting of their employees on their sleep and their well-being? Sleep doesn't seem to be something that's ever mentioned in the work environment because it's not work. But should that be taken into account, do you think?
Well, of course, I'm going to say yes, Santa. I think it is increasingly taken into account. So, for example, there's a couple of NHS trusts around the country, who are monitoring the sleep of their staff in hospitals, for example, factoring in sleep to the way they say arrange shift work, for instance. It's not routine yet, but I think it is beginning to gain traction. Even in the cutthroat corporate world, there's some recognition now that the quality of sleep in the around the workplace has a bearing on everyone in the company. So there's some studies showing that if senior managers sleep well, that's going to exacerbate their that's gonna disrupt their behavior. They're more likely to become impulsive. They're more likely to make unethical decisions, and that sort of trickles down through the hierarchy of workplace. Um, so the evidence is accumulating, and hopefully that will lead to some more routine sort of actions. It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, it does begin to blur the lines between professional and private life. And obviously there's a whole sort of ethical minefield around the sort of wearable devices that people use to attempt to track their sleep as well, whether that's wrist worn like a smartwatchy type thing, or even a headband you can wear to monitor your brain activity overnight. There's lots of really, really exciting and positive opportunities, as long as we use them sensibly, which historically we don't. But you can change that, Tim. You can change that.
Well, I think that's a fact. I hadn't thought about that, but I mean, we all wear these watches nowadays, don't we? That tell us how well we're sleeping and all that kind of stuff. Do we all really actually need to know that, or is that actually kind of, it's a bit like, I run a lot, and I must admit I get very obsessed with looking at the stats and everything afterwards when I look back over a run. But people are doing the same thing with their sleep now. Is that counterintuitive in a way? Does that actually kind of stop people sleeping better? What are the pros and cons?
It certainly can do. And again, it's sort of an individual thing. I think you have to recognize, just be honest with yourself about what it's doing for you. So I, as a sleep researcher for many years, completely avoided any self-monitoring. And then we started a project where we were doing self-monitoring on groups of children and young people. And I thought, okay, I should probably see what this is like for myself. And I found even a sort of off-the-shelf, cheap and cheerful wrist-worn device with an app quite disruptive. I mean, I just don't like wearing anything on my wrist in bed. That's one stupid but obvious thing. And then I was waking up and immediately looking at my sleep score, and then it brought it to the forefront in not a particularly helpful way for me. Whereas I have spoken to other people who've said, actually, this is really useful. It gives me an objective measure, even if it's not accurate. And it allows me to keep track of what other factors influence my sleep, for example. So it isn't a one size fits all.
I always think it's quite easy.
Certainly.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think it's quite amusing when you say someone, "Did you have a good night's sleep?" And they go, "Hang on, I'll tell you in a minute." And they pick up their phone and they have that go, actually I did, yes. They can't tell you just off the top of their head. They have to look it up on their phone first.
I know, modern life is... I mean, I've sat at a restaurant with someone who wanted to know what the weather was like, so she looked on her phone instead of look out the window. It's a similar kind of thing, but I mean, it does present a lot of opportunities, and it does allow us to gather evidence that can hopefully improve quality of life and change policy. So there's some horrific stats about noise pollution, for example, and how many deaths per year that's responsible for, and that's in part mediated through its effects on disrupting sleep. And so, we can gather that evidence and keep cities quieter, for instance, then it will help in the long run. But like everything, it is pros and cons. And a lot of these devices just aren't very accurate. They're made for that mythical average beast. It doesn't quite exist. So there's some ways to go with the technology yet.
Yeah. Just going back a step to employers. What are your thoughts on the sort of we see in other countries, in some of our European colleagues, perhaps taking midday siestas, and in Japan we hear about these sleep pods and things like that companies have for employees to go and take a break. Are they a good thing? Should we be taking those kind of approaches? Is there something in that? Should we be taking a siesta at lunchtime?
Oh dear. Well, personally, I love a siesta, preferably in a hammock, but there isn't a hammock available off camera in my office, unfortunately. I mean, naps do have to be treated with caution because, of course, they can easily set up a vicious cycle where you nap for too long and then you struggle to sleep at night and so on. But, most of the evidence supports the benefits of a short 20, 30-minute nap, but not too late, close to the middle of the day. I've worked in universities in the US where, there wasn't a specific facility, but nobody cared if you lay down on the sofa in the office and had a snooze. So yeah, I mean, maybe making the option available is no bad thing.
Does it improve performance in the afternoons if people do that?
Depends, as usual, performance of what and so on. But yeah, there certainly is some evidence that well-timed, regulated naps can have many of the benefits of good quality overnight sleep. But again, depends how you're measuring those benefits. Depends on the age of the subjects and all the rest of it. I mean, my fear is, personally, the reason I love a nap is that I'm, chronically slightly sleep deprived, like a lot of people. So I go down like a ton of bricks, and then I just struggle to wake up again. Left to my own devices, I would sleep through till the middle of the night. So it's a slightly dangerous thing for me. It only works if my wife is there to kick me after 20 minutes.
Yeah. I always find if I have a nap or something during the day, I always sleep worse at night. I find it hard to get sleep at night if I've slept during the day. So I think everyone's different, aren't they, in that respect? I'd like to talk about sleep hygiene. Now, it's always struck me as a bit of a strange term in itself. It sounds like the need to have a shower before you go to bed more than anything else. But tell me, what would your top tips be for people in terms of sleep hygiene and what the things they can do, or the things or the sort of the environment they should create in order to facilitate a really good night's sleep?
So it's fair of you to ask, but I risk straying into the territory of those kind of bog standard articles, those disparaging about earlier. So I guess my first tip is enjoy sleep's possibilities rather than fretting about sleep, which I know is easier said than done. But as a society, I think that's the kind of attitude we should start with. And I guess I'm sure not everyone listening is a parent, but you can probably still imagine how you might get a young child to sleep. And I have 2 kids who don't need much help getting to sleep nowadays, but they did when they were babies. So what do? You implement a routine. You make sure they're not hungry. You don't often feed babies gin and tonic, but you make sure they're not intoxicated in any way. You make sure they've had an active day. You make sure they're in a nice, cool, quiet, dark room. All those things, even if you're not a parent, that you can imagine doing in those desperate weeks where you're trying to get your blinking baby to sleep. Think about how you might apply them to yourself, I guess. And I know that you can't live your life to the same rigid pattern day by day. Nobody can. But within reason, you can sort of aim for, you can have an aspirational sort of bedtime, and you can think about when you eat and exercise relative to that bedtime. If you do like and have the opportunity to exercise, that's brilliant. If you can do it earlier in the day, in the morning daylight, for example, outside, that's perfect. So again, just from my experience, I know that if I go for a run first thing in the morning, preferably in summertime when it's light, that will really help me sleep at night. Whereas if I go for a run in the evening, I'll still be a bit highly strung, and that won't help me sleep. It's all pretty logical, bog standard stuff, to be honest. But again, I think it's the attitude that's important. I think enjoy the fact that there are lots of small, subtle, cheap, accessible things you can do to help your brain do its job and to help you just enjoy sleep more. But for some people suffering from insomnia, I know that it's without beyond their reach. I feel so sorry for people who are chronically deprived of sleep. It's just miserable things.
It's a couple of really interesting points there. I think exercise is a funny one, isn't it? I mean, you would assume, one part of you would assume if you exercise to the point of exhaustion and you're knackered afterwards, then you're just going to drop off and you're going to go to sleep. But I know that's not the case. I used to play badminton on a regular basis, but I think our session was 8 to 9 p.m. because that's the only time I could get my friends together to play. I never slept well after that. I'd come back, and my head would just be kind of try and put my head down. There's no way I could sleep. So I'd end up staying up late in order to kind of let things die down a bit in order to get to sleep. So exercise is a funny one for that. You kind of, one part of you would assume you're just going to get straight to sleep because you're knackered, but actually in reality, that's not the case.
Yeah. And I think, take a bit of time to recognize yourself when you're in that sort of state. Don't worry about uphill battles when you sort of If you're getting down into bed thinking, oh, I'm not going to be able to sleep, then don't get down into bed. Within reason, I'm not saying you just stay up till 4 a.m, but think of something else you could do that will so ease you into that state. For me, it's listening to music, obviously the right kind of music, preferably. People often ask me what I do to sleep well, and I used to tell them, although now I have to admit I don't sleep that well. We bought better pillows. For years I never really worried about pillows, and I do sometimes use a lavender spray, and that's not because I think there's any biological pathway that leads from a nice waft of lavender to my brain going to sleep. It's just part of setting the familiar scene. I quite like the smell. I associate that smell now with my head hitting the pillow. I think it just helps as part of the routine to sort of to set the scene. I'm not advocating everyone rushes out to buy lavender pillow spray, but think about
I think everyone will. There'll be a rush on lavender spray.
Give me a chance to set up the lavender spray company first. Somebody beat me to it, I think. Just take stock of it. I mean, again, these are luxuries and they're not available to everyone, but take stock of your bedroom. What do you like about it? Beef up those bits. What annoys you? Get rid of them.
I wanted to talk a little bit about, you just mentioned insomnia there, and in my work and at the charity I work for, one of the things we hear a lot is people saying they can't turn their heads off. They wish they could just turn their heads off at night. They've got racing thoughts. They lie down at night and their head's just full of stuff going round and round in their heads, whether it's worries about work or what's happening the next day, or whatever that might be. Is there a solution to that? Is there anything you would recommend or anywhere that people could turn to for support when we're facing those situations?
Well, again, the important qualifier that, I'm not a sleep doctor and that I'm not great at sleeping myself for those same reasons, actually. So we mentioned before, some studies suggesting that if you take a moment, not just before bed, maybe half an hour before you settle down to sort of list some of the things that are on your mind for the next day, that can help some people. I think, from my experience, that sort of helps. Obviously, it doesn't achieve, it doesn't get those things off the list, but it helps me to park them somehow. Mm-hmm. I have a kind of a go-to mental scene that I use to help calm me. It involves deep breathing and sort of using the breathing as the starting point to then relax my body physically. I guess it's mindfulness related. And there's certainly evidence that that mindfulness exercises can help sleep. The sort of first line therapy of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, there's good evidence it works, freely available through apps and so on. So I guess if my sort of casual observer type suggestions don't fly, then you should go and see a doctor and kind of push for that CBTI, as it's known. There's good evidence it works, but it doesn't work for everyone. These are all fairly generic things that are easier said than done. That's all I have to offer at this point, really.
Yeah, that's fine. That's no problem at all. You mentioned earlier in the interview that sleep obviously changes with age and all through our life from childhood all the way through to adulthood and into old age. But as we do get older, what can we expect in terms of changes to our sleep patterns?
Whenever I give a public lecture to the non-suffering folk of Bristol, most of my questions come from older people who struggle to sleep. And it's true that the duration of sleep drops off during old age, and it's not really clear biologically why that is. The archetypal grandparent nodding off every time they sit in the armchair, that happens because people are struggling to sleep at night. We don't know whether that is just a product of the nervous system degenerating, not to put too fine a point on it, or whether, somehow the body is programmed to need less sleep. But so generally, unfortunately, the average is you sleep for shorter time, it's more disturbed. What can you do to stop that? Well, the usual stuff, really: maintaining the exercise and the routines, I think the same general sleep hygiene rules apply. There's lots of interest in sleep and its contributions to neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. But the positive flip side is there's lots of opportunities to try and improve sleep in old age and see if that at least slows progression of those disorders. So lots of excitement at the moment about what's called the glymphatic system, which, in science journalism terms is normally referred to as the brain taking a shower overnight. So, alongside all this brain activity, which is processing our memories and emotions, there's also a change in the rate at which fluids move through the brain and essentially carry away the waste products of all our daily thinking. And there's some thought that process might be disrupted, and that might lead to the kinds of pathologies like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So if we can augment that process, maybe we can slow degeneration in old age. So lots of exciting research in that space at the moment, none of which I'm doing personally. But I think, again, I'm trying to give reasons for hope rather than reasons for worry. And I think there are good reasons for hope, but still a lot to understand about, as I said, the chicken and egg.
And if that's not an area you're specifically focused on, I mean, what are your upcoming sort of areas of study? What's on the horizons for you in terms of what areas are you specifically focusing on in your work?
Not middle-aged men, because although we're a hapless bunch and we deserve some tender living care, we tend to have biased the system too much in our favour historically. So the things we're most excited about as a lab are, as I mentioned earlier, working with children and young people who are at high risk of psychiatric disorders. And in that case, the high risk relates to their genetics. So they've been unlucky. Their genotype means that on average, 1 in 4 of them will go on to develop a disorder like schizophrenia. We don't know which 1 in 4. So if we can use sleep as a therapeutic window to understand what's going on and to intervene early, then that's exciting. And then on a rather different but somewhat related note, we're also interested in psychedelics, as a lot of people are at the moment. The psychedelics are exciting potential new therapeutics for depression, for instance. But nobody has really factored sleep into that equation yet. And I have a sort of pet theory that maybe part of what those drugs are doing, and when they work, they have antidepressant properties after just a single dose. Those antidepressant properties last for a few weeks, for example. So we're trying to understand whether a single dose of those psychedelic drugs, things like magic mushrooms, psilocybin, for example, might modulate brain activity during sleep in a way that's useful for processing trauma, for instance. Those are the two things that we're most excited about at the moment.
On that first one, in regards to children and young people, is there anything that you would say that parents should keep an eye out for in terms of particular sleep issues with their children that might suggest that they might be more susceptible to some of the issues you were mentioning then?
Not really. I don't want to cause the alarm, but factoring sleep into parenting is, as almost all parents know, is really important, and factoring it in an age-appropriate way. So the famous transition to adolescence, where you get a shift in your biological clocks, so adolescents are driven to want to sleep later and therefore to wake later. That's natural and healthy. They're not being lazy. They're just shifting their timing. And yet society doesn't give them the chance. So even though they shift their sleep onset later, we still wake them up to go to school or what have you. So some researchers have cited a sort of perfect storm afflicting adolescents at the moment, and shrinking their window of opportunity for sleep. I would say to parents, don't worry about things that might be going wrong. Just do what you can to encourage things that can go right. And the studies of shifting school start times later, for example, for adolescents, have been quite small so far because it's a lot of hard work to make that happen. But where they've been implemented, it seems to benefit the young people. So, bear that in mind next time you're trying to drag your teenager out of bed on a Sunday morning.
Very good advice. Thank you. Thank you, Matt, for that. suppose the last question I must ask you is, do you have a most memorable night's sleep anywhere? Is there anywhere that you've slept or any place you've been in the world that you think, God, I had a great night's sleep then?
That is a good question. I've honestly never thought about that. I'm so obsessed with all the places I've slept terribly. I'm trying to think where I've slept well. I would say, though, that I always sleep extremely well, although I've never slept overnight, in a hammock. And, the gentle rocking motion, as long as it's not too violent, some people have suggested might actually tap into the natural brain rhythms that happen during deep sleep. So during deep sleep, there's a sort of wave of activity about once per second that sort of propagates from the back to the front of your brain. And that seems to be important in supporting sleep-dependent memory processing, for example. So I love the idea, yet to be proven, that maybe a sort of gentle rocking like that can help to nurture your brain's natural rhythms during sleep and therefore improve the sleep quality. So I will think, Tim, about your question and try to remember where I slept well. I mean, that probably in my youth is probably the answer, but in the meantime, I'll take the hammock, please.
Yeah, well, I've got to go and get myself a hammock now. That sounds like a great idea. Matt, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been really fascinating. And yeah, I wish you a good night's sleep. So thank you ever so much for your time.
Yeah, same to you, Tim. Thanks again for the opportunity.
That's it for another episode. Thanks to Professor Matt Jones for giving us such a fascinating insight into the complexities of sleep. You'll find links to some great articles by Matt, further exploring the connection between sleep and mental health in the show notes. Don't forget, you can keep the conversation going by answering our episode question as well. And for this episode, we'd like to know, does the amount you sleep impact your mental well-being? You can answer it on the Spotify episode page, the link to which can be found in the episode notes or through the Linktree site in the show profile. You can also interact with the show by sending us a voice message. We're always really keen to hear what you think of our guests and the subjects we're discussing. So tell us whether your own sleep experiences reflect what Matt's been telling us, or if you've ever experienced something completely different. We'd like to know about that as well. You can also tell us your ideas for topics and things you'd like us to cover. Again, just head to the episode notes or the Linktree site for more details and the link to do so. And finally, if you've enjoyed the show, please leave us a review and subscribe on whatever platform you usually get your podcasts. In the meantime though, look after yourselves, sleep well, and I'll see you soon. Take care.